Hey, what's up guys? Today's video is one that, I'm not kidding, I've been wanting to make since before I even had a YouTube channel, and that is a video making something for Jimmy Diresta. He is a huge inspiration to me, and I'm serious when I say this. He is probably the biggest inspiration behind this YouTube channel. He is someone I have watched for years and someone I have very much looked up to, and I was actually lucky enough to be able to go hang out with him in New York over the summer, if you didn't know. And I was there for a few days. He gave me one of his famous ice picks that you can see here. And so today I wanted to do something nice for him, kind of return the favor. So I'm going to be making a ring that's inspired by his ice pick. And so I'm going to be using brass. Obviously you can see it's brass completely on the exterior. It's got a steel stabby end, but other than that, brass. And it's got his name stamped into it, and it's a hexagon shape. So I'm going to be taking a piece of brass, machining it into a hexagon shape, and then just trying to do whatever finishing touches I can do. I'm going to make that into a ring, obviously. And then I've got this stamp set here. I'm going to stamp Diresta onto it. If you haven't seen any of his videos, he stamps stuff like crazy. So I think that'll perfectly match stuff. And then I've got this piece of ebony here. We're gonna make a special magnetic closing ring box that I'll get into later. So that's the idea behind the video. Just huge shout out to Jimmy for being who he is, and I hope you really enjoy your ring. All right, so first things first, I've got this 2-foot rod of brass, and I need to cut down a smaller piece so that it'll actually fit into my lathe. So that's what you see me cutting here. It's just kind of a cookie-shaped disc, and it's just a little bit wider than the final ring will be. That'll give me enough room to trim it down and make sure both of the faces on it are perfectly parallel. So that's the first step. I'm just trimming down both of the faces, and then after that, I need to bore a hole out in the middle, and that'll allow me to put it onto my expanding ring mandrel. And so once I have that up to the size that it'll fit on the mandrel, but not to the final ring size. That's important because you want to not go too far during these steps, because there's a lot of sanding and finishing steps that I still need to do, and that can widen the ring out a lot. So I'm leaving it undersized to this point, and then once I have some of the other shaping done to it and I'm ready to begin actually polishing it, that's when I'll go ahead and break out the calipers and make sure that we get it to the exact size. And for future reference, if any of you guys make Jimmy rings, he is a size 13. Don't tell him I told you. Anyways, now that I've got the hole bored out in the middle, I'm ready to start shaping the hexagon shape on the outside of the ring. And for this, I wanted to use the rotary table on my mill, but I actually couldn't find the rotary table. I moved recently and I just haven't seen it since then. And so I'm resorting to doing it by hand on the belt sander. So this was quite a bit of a challenge. It was pretty tricky getting it set to perfect 90-degree angle. It just took a while. It just did a lot of testing to make sure that it was spot on. But once I got it to that point, it was a little bit more straightforward. The first step I did was just sanding a flat face into it. Once I had the flat face sanded into it, I was able to base the rest of my measurements off of that. So I got a really nice flat face on there. And then what you can see I did is I just used a little bit of super glue and I glued it to this big 1, 2, 3 block. And the reason I glued it to the block is because it has such a long straight line on it that I can line up with the sanding table on the belt sander. And so all I need to do is hold the ring against the sander and make sure that my 1, 2, 3 block is lining up perfectly parallel with the lines on my sanding table. So that saved me a lot of time, and I was able to get some really precise angles using just these hand methods. So after getting all of my equipment dialed in, it was fairly easy to do those first 2 faces. Because it was a circle I was starting with, I could literally start wherever I wanted, and then the other one, I just had to do it exactly opposite from there. So that's really easy, but these next 2 ones were kind of a challenge. This was the most challenging of all the faces, I would say, and it's because they needed to be positioned correctly relative to the other 2 faces. And so what I did is I just lined the ring up with a protractor, and then I marked a line coming out of the center of the ring at a 120-degree angle to one of those first 2 edges. And to get the second side that I needed, I was able to just mirror the first line that I drew. And so now that I had those 2 lines, all I needed to do was go back to my belt sander and then run the ring into the belt sander at a perfectly perpendicular angle to those lines that I just drew. And that'll give me the correct angles that I need for those other 2 faces on the hexagon of the ring. And then after that point, I've still got that one rounded side on the ring, but that's really easy. I just need to glue the semi-completed hexagon back onto my 1, 2, 3 block, and then do the exact same method where I just run it into the belt sander, and I'd use my calipers to determine once I'd sanded to the correct wall thickness. That'll make sure that each of the faces are the same width, and so that the hexagon itself looks really nicely proportioned, almost like it was cut on a mill. So now I've got the hexagon shaped nicely. I need to throw it onto my expanding ring mandrel here, and I want to give it a little bit of character, and I want it to match the look of the ice pick itself. So I'm using my carbide lathe bit here to chamfer the edges of it, and you can see how the chamfer gives a really cool look to the ring. Because of the hexagon shape of it, the chamfer itself extends further on the points of the hexagon, so it just gives the ring kind of a unique look that you can tell was patterned after the ice pick. So that chamfer was actually the last major shaping step that I needed to do to the ring, and so I'm ready to go ahead and start sanding it to size and then polishing it up. So I use my Dremel at first and I just slowly sand it away until I get it to just barely shy of a size 13, and then that's when I switch over to the sandpaper and I smooth everything out. I start with a rough about 150 grit, then I move to a 220 grit sandpaper, and I work my way all the way up to about a 2000 grit, and at that point I've gotten rid of any of the sanding lines, any of those marks. That's when I can switch to a polish. So I start with a medium one that just smooths everything out, and then I switch over to a high polish, and that's what gives us the nice glossy reflective finish. Now I need to worry about the outer faces on the ring. You can see I've got some really harsh scratches from the rough sanding we did for the shaping of the hexagon. And so what I did for this is I just had a bunch of different grits of sandpaper for my belt sander. I think my first belt was a 220 grit, and I just sanded all of the faces until I got rid of all of the deep scratches, and then I switched over to a 400 grit, and after that I switched up to a 600 grit. And typically I like to sand the ring up to at least 1000 grit in order to get rid of any of the sanding marks. And so what I did to combat that is I started with a grittier polish, one that's designed to remove scratches, and so that's a black compound that I used. And that takes quite a bit of time, but I just did a really thorough job with that and got rid of any of those sanding lines with that. And then I switched to my standard ones. I did the medium polish, then the high polish. Now, of course, as a finishing touch, I wanted to stamp Diresta onto the ring. That'll match the ice pick, and if you know Jimmy, you know that he stamps or spray paint stencils almost every single thing he does, and so definitely something I couldn't avoid doing with this project. So I've got this little tiny 1mm letter set here, and I just stamped Diresta in it as best I could. It is really tricky to get it even with such a small stamping set, and that's kind of Jimmy's style. You'll see a lot of the stamping he does, he's not worried about getting the lines and everything perfect, he's just trying to put his name on it. So that's the ring, and I think it turned out really nicely, and you can see how it compares to the ice pick. I think it does match it pretty well, and this was just a lot of fun to make. It's a lot of fun to have a challenge, something to pattern your ring after. It just gives you a lot of direction while you're designing and actually crafting the ring, so it's always fun to do that. But now I wanted to make a special box for his ring, and so that's what you'll see me doing here. I start out with a piece of ebony, and I've got a design that I've done something similar to in the past where I add magnets to it, so that's what I'm going to do, and I think it's going to make just a gorgeous, beautiful looking box. And making the box is fairly straightforward, so I won't bother narrating this part, but I did want to say make sure to stick around until the end of the video, because I'm just going to have a little video clip of Jimmy unboxing the whole thing once I send it out to him. To get accurate, and so that's why you see me doing that really weird technique where I've got the brass pin with a little sharp end on it. I'm using that to get a very precise hole of where I need to drill the magnet, and if you try making one of these boxes yourself, you'll see why that's so important. If you get it off by even 1/2 millimeter, it seems, your box won't line up perfectly at the end, so that's why you see me going to such an extreme measure to get that hole placed just perfectly. So that's it for the video, guys. I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Jimmy for working with me on the project. It was a lot of fun. If you're new around here, you can subscribe if you haven't already. But other than that, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.